Okay, well, nearly everyone looks at the design argument as being what we call in logic an argument from analogy. Now, arguments from analogy are not strict, airtight mathematical arguments. They're not what we call deductive arguments, like the ontological argument would be. They are probabilistic arguments. In other words, they're saying if A is like B in various respects, then probably A will also be like B in a further respect that's not so obvious. So we're saying things like, well, if the watch is like the eye in needing a design, in having parts that work together toward an end or a purpose that it serves. If they are alike in those respects, then the argument goes, well, then probably the watch is like the eye in the further, not so obvious respect of needing a designer, and who would the designer of the eye be but God? So again, the analogy's conclusion then is that the author of nature, God, has a mind like a human mind, that is, a mind capable of designing things so that they fulfill a function or purpose. But since the works of nature are far more complex than created human products like a tick-tock watch, then the conclusion is that God has a greater mind than mere human beings. So God exists and has intelligence similar to human intelligence. Now, we looked at Cleanthes. Cleanthes is he would be, say, a deist in Jefferson's time. He would have been a very intellectual Christian. Cleanthes is somebody who puts a lot of stock in these arguments and wants his faith to be based on reason more than just the acceptance of revelation. Daimia, and I think Hume is using this term, so everyone's taken the objective, right? Daimia, I think Hume uses this term pejoratively. I think it means small-minded. We see the word diminished. Daimia is your typical person on the street, not very intellectual, but a typical, pretty much fundamentalist believer. Yeah.
That term is not there, right? Because you're saying that, how do you spell that? You're saying
Daimia, D-E-M-I-A. When I say Daimia objects, maybe it's not in your, it's on the screen. Again, these pages refer to a different text. Daimia doesn't like it that the design argument, Cleanthes' argument, is what we call a posteriori. That's a nice 50-cent word for after and based on experience, based on observations about the world, right? In the design argument, we get going by observing that things function, have parts like the watch that function for the serving of a purpose, and that happens in nature as well. and depends on an observed similarity of the deity to men. Damia points out correctly that as such it's only a probable argument, right? It does not claim to prove God with the absolute certainty of a mathematical proof in the way the ontological argument claims to do that. But Damia would rather see a necessary a priori demonstration like the ontological argument. And there were some others around in his time. But Philo isn't so worried about that. Now remember, Philo, you can see the word Philo for philosopher. He's the philosophic skeptic. He's Hume in this dialogue, right? Philo doesn't object that the design argument is only probabilistic, but he thinks it's a weak analogy. And in other words, the more unlike are the things that you're comparing in an analogy, the weaker your argument from analogy. And Hume is going to make this point in some of the slides that follow. So he says that the design argument is not as strong as other probabilistic arguments. I lit a match this morning, right? I was pretty confident that I knew what was going to happen when I pushed it over the striker. Why? Because I've seen that happen many, many times, right? There are things, repeatable events. And of course, in a laboratory, you try to repeat an event and observe it. So that a stone will fall. I was watching a show at a friend's house, and she had cable, and these guys were prospecting for gems. And where they were prospecting, there was this big rock that looked kind of precarious above them, and they were all kind of wary of whether or not it was going to fall, right? And they knew what would happen if the rock fell, because they've seen rocks fall before. Right? In other words, there are events that are repeatable, that fire will burn, or that a match will light when you strike it, that the earth is solid. These are based on thousands of observations. And also, I knew what this match would do because I've often struck similar matches in the same way, right? I'm comparing, as we would say, apples with apples. And so these repeatable, exactly similar cases assure us of a similar event. So even though it's just a probable argument that the next match I strike is going to light, it's a pretty doggone good one, right? Because it's based on repeatable events. Now, one thing he says the design argument tries to do is it's obviously saying that the whole universe needed a designer. But he says there's basically only one example. Now, we're not talking about multiverses in Hume's day. It amazes me that physicists actually are seriously entertaining that possibility. I mean, I studied modal logics in grad school in the early 80s that put those theoretical possibilities out there of other worlds, but not seriously. Well, at any rate, he says, look, we've only got one example of design, the universe we live in. I mean, there's kind of a joke about a final exam, which would require a lot of work, probably more than 2 hours, where the first question is, describe the universe. And the second part of the question is, give 2 examples. Well, that's a joke because we don't have 2 examples. We only have 1. So he says if we're talking about comparing repeatable events to a non-repeatable event and an event that we have only 1 example of, he says that's not comparing apples with apples here. So he says it's an analogy, but it may be only a weak analogy because you're not comparing things that are very similar. You're comparing a watch to the universe, or as he says later, built things like ships and houses. Now, Hume tries to educate his readers on the basics of arguments from analogy. The hall and everything. Okay. Hopefully she shows up today. So, Hume basically wants to say that if you depart from the similarity, that is, if the things you're comparing are not that similar, then this diminishes the evidence that the argument from analogy gives for its conclusion. And he says, well, take a simple analogy like circulation of the blood, right? It's beyond doubt to conclude that blood circulates in other humans from observing, the blood circulation and what happens in a human body, right? Because you're comparing exactly similar cases, the case of one human being with another. And he says we can start getting some dissimilarities here, but we still might have a strong argument, right? He says it's only a presumption, but a strong one, to conclude from human blood circulation, or to conclude something about human blood circulation from observation of it in frogs and fishes. And I don't even know if they allow people to dissect a frog while it's alive. They did that in biology class in high school, and you can actually see the little heart beating there. And then you do it in at the end of the experiment by pithing it. Not that sounds like something else, but so he says even from observing something in animals, we can conclude something in human beings. But note, it's not as strong an argument, right? I mean, what are they required to do before they get a new potential drug to market? They say, well, this has worked out fine. This has stopped the spread of cancer or has attacked AIDS in lab rats or in bunny rabbits. Well, they say, well, okay, that's fine. But now you got to do some clinical trials with real human beings, because not everything about non-human animals is similar to what we have in human beings. They don't have a pancreas. That's why we're told not to give our cats and dogs chocolate. They can't process it. Their anatomy isn't quite the same as ours. But Hume says, still, if things are close, but not exact, you can still have a decent argument from analogy. But now, we still have no leaves on the trees except the, evergreens out there. Why? Well, one of the things that happens, as I was taught in general biology in college, is in the fall, the sap goes down to the roots. And it's the sap that provides the nutrients for the leaves to be there, right? The chlorophyll and the xanthophyll stay, and the chlorophyll goes down, the xanthophyll and the carotene stays up there, and that's what gives leaves their orange and yellow colors. But he says you could look at something like a corn stalk. Anybody see a corn stalk cut? You see little tubules, and you say, well, okay, there's little tubules through which sap flows, and I have veins through which blood flows. So does that mean that sap in plants circulates in just the same way that blood circulates in animals? Well, you know the answer is no, it doesn't. So Hume is saying, if you compare two things that aren't alike at all, not only don't you have a very good argument supporting your conclusion, but you could be led to an absolutely wrong conclusion. And of course, Hume, as a religious skeptic, would think we're led to a wrong conclusion to conclude that God is the maker of the universe. So again, he says, to have strong arguments, you should adopt the principle that similar effects follow from similar causes. On seeing a house, we conclude with the greatest certainty that it had a builder, right? My home, the one I inherited from my parents, has a building date of 1900. You say, isn't that interesting that it's such an even, easy to remember number? Well, there's a reason why it has that. Because we don't know what year it was built in, because the records for my home and many other people's homes were destroyed in the Great Baltimore Fire in the early 1900s, right? But just because the records are destroyed, I don't have any problem at all with the conclusion that my home needed a designer and builder, because every other home I've seen needs it. So why, it didn't just spontaneously grow on that lot, it didn't grow from a seed. It needed a designer. So he says, houses we've observed in the past have had builders, so this one must have had one. That's, but again, he says we can't observe cases of universes being made. He says the universe is not like a man-made object like a house or later a ship. These are dissimilar things. So he says the presumption of a similar cause is only a guess, conjecture, presumption. So Hume's first, big move in criticizing the design argument is to say that if the cases that are being compared are very different, then what you have is a very weak argument supporting the conclusion of a designer. Now, you can say, but look at the order that the universe displays. Now here he says, look, there's more than one potential cause of order in the universe. So Philo and Cleanthes agree that the following things would only be a proof of design if we had experience to show that they proceed from it. Order, arrangement, adjustment to final causes. This is where we bring in purposes again. A final cause for Aristotle was the purpose a thing was going to serve. And so we're saying that a thing is adjusted to a purpose, like the watch or like the eye or the ear. So what he says is, unless we had observational evidence to back up our claim that order and arrangement of things such that they serve purposes came from design, he says a priori, that is, before any experience, he says the above things, order, arrangement, and just the final causes, could be caused by something internal to matter itself. Now, Hume is writing in probably the 1760s, right? As I said, he gave instructions that this book not be published till after his death. He died in 1776. And he's writing about 70 years before Darwin. Darwin publishes first in the 1840s, right? Hume is a philosopher, not a scientist, but as a lot of men in those days, intellectual people also knew a lot about the science of their day, because there was much less of it to get a handle on. I mean, and so basically, Hume, as a non-scientist, is speculating logically that without any observational evidence, for all we know, order and arrangement could proceed from internal causes within matter itself. Now, it's later on that Darwin gives us the story of how he thinks that happens by, adaptations, and some members of a species get advantageous variations through adaptation, and that gives them a leg up in the battle for survival, and so the members of the species with the new, better adaptations tend to survive and win the evolutionary struggle for existence. And so, Darwin's original story of evolution is that it's an entirely random process, and did not have us or anything else as its goal or end. We came along as a happy accident. And so the idea is, through adjustment to their surroundings, animals over the course of millions of years develop better and better eyes, until we finally have the eyes that are in our eye sockets. And they weren't designed and created, but for Darwin, internal causes in matter, through evolution, natural selection over millions of years, brought about that order. Now, my problem with evolution as an entirely natural process goes back to something I read when I was in high school. It was an argument by a scientist in a book called Human Destiny by LeConte Denoy. And he wasn't like a fundamental Christian or anything, but he basically worked out what the odds were against even one strand of DNA and the order and arrangement together coming about by mere chance. And the odds are astronomically against. I think it's easy to tell a story of adaptation and change over millions of years once you bring on the scene animals and plants that are complex enough that they're capable of that sort of adaptation. My problem with it as an entirely natural process comes with the question of, yeah, but how do you get the perspective, you know, without design? So, anyway, let's move on. So, Hume is a non-scientist. He says, he speculates, matter may cause its own order, as well as a mind causing order by direct design. The elements may fall into some exquisite arrangement by some unknown internal material cause. Here I like to use an example from my old, what a chemistry professor at a college around Charlottesville called the Book of Forbidden Chemistry. It was a golden book of chemistry experiments that nobody would be allowed to publish nowadays. But when I was in the 7th grade, I had one. And one of the experiments, which was less controversial, this wasn't showing you how to make gunpowder or how to make primitive explosives using potassium permanganate. This is a good rainy day thing to do with your children. You might not want to have me very much of it, but have you ever gone to like an old general store, like you get at the Cracker Barrel, and you see rock candy? Anybody know what rock candy is? What is it? Crystallized sugar, that's right. It's pretty much 100%, refined sugar, whatever, mother wants her child to have. But anyway, there's some experiments showing how to do this. You all learned in chemistry that when you heat a liquid up like water, you can dissolve a lot more stuff in it, right? So you heat water on the stove, and you pour a bunch of Domino sugar or regular sugar in it, right? And it all dissolves. And then what do? Put maybe a ruler or something with a string hanging down. And then as the water cools, it forms sugar crystals. Now, if you look at those crystals, they look like they've been deliberately designed and cut by someone. They form exact geometric shapes. Or if you think of a quartz crystal. But here, the order and the arrangement of things into those shapes is as a result of internal causes and the laws of nature operating. So Hume says that it's as easy to conceive of that what are friends for. It's okay, I'll let it kick the voice now. Okay. Basically, he is saying that there might be some natural principle that's the cause of order, not an external designer, is what his bottom line is. And I say note the similarity to the later claims of Darwin. Okay? Now here again, as a non-scientist, what he does is he speculates that there might be causal forces at work, and these are some of the ordinary causal forces you would have known if you were, an armchair scientist living in the late 1700s, right? Forces like heat or cold, magnetism, attraction or repulsion, and others, right? Heat or cold works in the sugar crystals. So he says design is only one of the forces in nature. Some things in nature affect others by design, he says, but it's illegitimate to reason that all do. It wrongly goes from the part to the whole. So, but of course a theist would say, well, okay, those sugar crystals fall into an exquisite arrangement due to the laws of nature, but who's the author of the laws of nature? You know. But he says it's a bad generalization to go from a single case. He says it's like the generation of a human being from that of a hare. Of course, he didn't know anything about cloning in his day, right? Now, here's something where Cleanthes weighs in with arguments that are similar to the later arguments of Paley. Remember, Paley wrote after Hume and actually read him. You know, Cleanthes, who, as you recall, first puts the design argument forward, says, look, there's millions of examples of design. And he gives the eye. And you can talk about human sexuality as others. And this basically was the tack that Paley took. Hume doesn't adequately answer this. In other words, you can say, well, okay, it's a bad analogy to compare the design of the whole universe with the making of a house or a watch. But is it a better analogy to take one, product of design like the eye? So, now, okay, so now he moves on to another aspect of the design argument, and that is, what are we to conclude about the nature of the designer from, the creation? Philo believes the world is very imperfect. And so I have that argument in an earlier slide. He says, well, from a contingent, imperfect world, we're supposed to conclude that the maker of that world is not finite but infinite, not contingent but necessary, not time-bound but eternal. And he says, well, can you get that from the very imperfect, and limited world we in fact live in? But Hume says, suppose I gave you your premise that the world isn't as imperfect as we think. He says, even if the world were perfect, we could not, from the perfection of the world, conclude that the maker itself was perfect. It says, from the complexity and beauty of a ship, we may form an exalted idea of the ingenuity of the carpenter who made it. Now, I am a carpenter's son. My dad was, in fact, in the merchant marine. He was a carpenter on a ship until we got a lot of containerized freight, and that put ship's carpenters out of business. You didn't need ship's carpenters doing things like building pallets for freight if the freight was in big metal boxes. At times, he would occasionally work down at Maryland Shipbuilding, Drydock, help to build ships. But he says, even if the product is impressive, it doesn't mean that every carpenter who worked on the ship was like a genius at creating this wonderful, impressive work of beauty, the ship. He says the carpenter could just be a stupid mechanic who imitated others and copied an art. You know, could not design it, but could build it. That's kind of where I'm at. I mean, you know, look at that illustration, right? And that's kind of impressive. If you go back, you know, look at that graphic of the eye, and you say, wow, you know, the designer and builder of this PowerPoint show must have been a pretty impressive, you know. But instead, you know, was an artistically challenged philosophy professor who knew how to cut and paste something into a PowerPoint, right? I didn't make up these nice graphics or the background stuff. You know, I basically copied an art. I have a very impressive website for the back end of it. But again, I work from a template. You know, the real geniuses are the people in GoDaddy who design the template. So you see what he's saying is even if nature were perfect, we couldn't conclude that the maker was necessarily perfect. Here, it's kind of interesting. Somebody like Cleanthes is not like a traditional believer like Daniel. I mean, for most theologians, and Aquinas would be one of them, right? We saw he's got that version of the design argument, you know, but his book on theology that contains the 5 proofs is, you know, about 2 inches thick, and the proofs take up 1 or 2 pages. Right, for most theologians, these natural arguments are sort of icing on the cake. But that's not what their faith rests on. So he says, if we're going to be like Cleanthes, who wants to say, no, I'm not interested in miracles and revelation. I'm more interested in a rational faith built on things like the design argument. And he would have been like the deists in Jefferson's time. Jefferson had his own copy of the New Testament, where I hear he cut out all references to miracles. Yeah, but still a firm believer in God. Well, Cleanthes is this type of intellectual, and Hume's arguments, I think, do more against somebody like Cleanthes who wants something like the design argument to do all the work, right? Than it would be against somebody who just takes it as one of a number of things they would refer to as the foundation of their faith. So he says, there are lots of options that are different from the conclusion that somebody like Paley or Aquinas wants to draw. The world could be the latest attempt in a string of botched and bungled worlds, right? The maker could have been inept, but improved over time, like somebody taking their first pottery course and they try to make a vase the first time and it turns out horrible, so they just kind of chuck it and start all over again from scratch. And so he says, from the design argument alone, you can't necessarily get the conclusion that the maker of the universe is the perfect God of Judeo-Christian theism. But he also says, look, you can't even get from those premises that the maker, if there were one, of the universe is only one, that there's only one maker. Philo challenges Cleanthes to show why on the design hypothesis there must be only one designer. He says houses and ships are built in cooperation by many individuals, right? We saw them building that huge STEM center across the street. There were many people working on that. So he says, why may not several lesser deities cooperate to produce a universe or a world? If that were the case, you would not then need each to have the extensive power and knowledge only one deity needs. Now, you got to understand where Hume is going with this. He's making a philosophical and logical point. It's not that Hume himself thinks that one of these options are more plausible than traditional theism, but he's trying to say logically, from the same assumptions, more than one conclusion is possible. But again, as I said last time, somebody like Aquinas would say, well, okay, yeah, logically, more than one conclusion is possible, but what seriousness should we give to those other possible options? Philo even goes on, he says, well, if you're going to portray God in human terms, why couldn't we even have them producing sexually like the Greeks thought, where there was a genealogy of the gods, right? Zeus had Kronos as his father, right? Then he had a mother. This would produce a genealogy of the gods as we would have in ancient Greece. It says, why not assume the deities to have human facial features, as the ancient Greeks did? Why not assert with Epicurus that reason must have human form since no one has seen otherwise? In other words, the gods must be like us because the gods are rational and we're rational, so the gods must look like us. You know, it's a good argument, right? So Philo says the design hypothesis then allows us to conclude at best that the universe arose from something like design, but he says everything else in one's theology in addition to this is wide open to fancy. You know, again, if you're just going to go from the design hypothesis. And he throws several other options, right? The world could be the inferior product of an old senile deity. He says all these options are out there as possible logical conclusions. Again, you got to see that he's not really arguing for one of these as better than theism. But he's saying from a logical perspective, they could just as well occur. He says the Brahmins thought that the world was spun by a spider, and if we were living in a planet of spiders, this would be a very likely hypothesis. You know, again, he's not arguing for this, but he's just throwing out various logical options there. So, okay. I think next time we'll look at the problem of evil. But, you know, something to think about. But the reason we do this treatment of the design argument is historically this was looked at as the most weighty response. I mean, I did a telecourse in the 1990s where the professor who ran the course basically thought that Hume had refuted Paley before Paley ever even wrote. But Paley did, I don't know if she knew that Paley actually had studied Hume, and there are things on on the internet about that showed that he had, he wasn't unaware of Hume's arguments here. He just didn't think they were as weighty as Hume thought they were. So, okay, again, if you missed the roll when it went around, we're going to go over the test next time, but we'll look a little bit at the problem of evil, because it's worth looking at on the other side of the coin. So, thanks for coming out. Have a good rest of the day.